So it's nice to be among friends. This is going to be a session on police reform. We thought about criminal justice, but we thought police reform is where there's a lot of action that's happening both on the state level and on the municipal level. And we don't usually talk about municipal happenings, but we do have a lot of chapters that do work in their municipality. So we thought this might be a good opportunity to look at what's happened at the state and what's happening on the local level. I'm going to ask both of the speakers to give their presentations. I will ask the questions, or please, everybody, just as they're speaking, if you want to put their questions in the chat, and then I can call on you to ask the question. So feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm on the issues committee, as John told you, and I do stuff around the criminal system. And so we thought I would be a good person to facilitate this, but I'm not nearly the expert that other people are. So I wanted to introduce Oami first. Oami Amarasingham, who graduated from Mount Holyoke College, there's degree in 2006. She earned her law degree from Northeastern University in 2012 and joined the ACLU of as legislative director in 2019 after serving for 10 years, working for 10 years at the ACLU's main affiliate. She was an actor there and advanced the ACLU's legislative agenda in Maine, working to pass on the First Nations privacy laws, expand access to reproductive health, and to reform Maine's approach in drug policy. And Oami and I have been working in the working group on criminal justice together. So I want to thank Oami for agreeing to be here. And she's going to talk about the state legislation and where we are at and what still needs to be done. Thank you all.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm so happy to be here. Is my audio coming through okay for folks? Okay, great. So I have a newish computer and it has there's a lot to learn about how it works and doesn't work. I'm Oami Amarasingham. I'm the Deputy Legislative Director at the ACLU of Mass. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about this bill, which actually passed with a lot of stuff in it. I think while the police reform legislation was moving, it was not at all clear that something was actually going to happen. There was, as you all know, enormous pressure from particularly police unions and other supporters of the police to do nothing or water the bill down to an almost meaningless piece of legislation. The Representative Miranda and Senator Cream filed an initial use of force bill in June of last year, immediately following nationwide historic protests calling for racial justice and police reform. And that bill really formed the basis for what ultimately passed in the legislature. And I think, as everyone knows, as is always the case, we didn't get everything we wanted, but the first round of legislation that was finally signed into law on New Year's Eve last year did have a significant number of reforms in it. And while we are certainly looking ahead to implementation and coming back for things that were cut out at the last minute, I do want to go over some of the really big victories that we secured in this legislation, and also thank you all in Progressive Mass and all of your members in particular for the enormous amount of pressure that you kept up on the State House. There is absolutely no way that this bill would have passed with as much in it as it had without a really consistent pressure from the public from June all the way through the final days when Governor Baker finally signed the bill into law in December. So I'm a glass half full kind of girl, so I'll start with the good stuff that was in the bill. First, the legislation creates, for the first time in Massachusetts, a statewide peace officer standards and training program, or commission, which we refer to in shorthand as POST. And this was really the central piece of the legislation, and this is what Governor Baker was also pushing for early on in the year. And this is a majority civilian commission that is tasked with certifying law enforcement officers, also has the authority to decertify law enforcement officers when they violate codes of conduct or violate the law. The commission also importantly has the authority to investigate misconduct and receive complaints of misconduct from civilians and from police departments. In addition, the commission regulates police, but it also has the authority and responsibility to certify police departments. And we're really interested to see how this plays out, whether departments that behave badly or have a pattern or practice of behaving badly will actually be held accountable by the commission. The commission will also be collecting a lot of data about misconduct, allegations of misconduct, complaints, and investigations and the outcomes of those investigations. Importantly, the legislation creates a list of 16 mandatory decertification offenses, including things that we've seen, scandals in Massachusetts about like overtime fraud, as well as racial discrimination and inappropriate uses of force. And then the bill also creates pretty significant limits on the use of force. Unfortunately, the enforcement of that is all within the Post Commission. So the Post Commission is tasked with investigating any allegations of inappropriate use of force. But the standards themselves that are in the bill are pretty comprehensive and followed Representative Miranda and Senator Cream's bill pretty closely. Most importantly, within the use of force limits, and again, this is the first time that Massachusetts will have statewide limits on the use of force. We heard from many police departments along the way that they already have a lot of policies that reflect these limits on use of force. I think it's a separate question of whether or not the training is adequate on those or whether or not violations are actually enforced. But this sets up standards that are statewide that every police department will have to follow. So some of the highlights of use of force provisions include a requirement, an explicit requirement, that police officers attempt to de-escalate a situation before they use force, and that when they do use force, it must be proportionate to the lawful goal that they're trying to accomplish. It also creates a duty to intervene for officers. So if an officer witnesses a colleague inappropriately using force, that officer has an obligation to step in and stop that inappropriate use of force. If someone fails to intervene when they should have, that is an offense that they can have to go up through the Post Commission for and could be decertified for. So there are hopefully some teeth along with that duty to intervene. There's also an explicit ban on chokeholds in all cases and limits on the use of tear gas and other less than lethal weapons like rubber bullets. A lot of us here on this call had called for a full out ban on the use of tear gas and rubber bullets and other quote unquote less than lethal weapons, which of course do cause very serious injury and can cause death because they're used inappropriately, even when they are used according to the way they're supposed to be used, they can still cause serious injury, but the legislature was not ready to go that far. So instead, there are limits on the use. In addition, there was a limit put in on the use of no-knock warrants. And this was in direct response to the killing of Breonna Taylor. And it's I also want to observe that it's been 1 year since her tragic and unnecessary killing, which happened because of the use of a no-knock warrant. So there is a limit in the legislation that has to do with no-knock warrants. It prohibits, in some circumstances, no-knock warrants if the officer knows that there are elders or children in the home. Unfortunately, the language was watered down quite a bit by the time it went to the governor's desk for the last, his signature in December. So it remains to be seen how much of a limit that will actually turn out to be. But it is, I think, worth mentioning that for the first time now in Massachusetts law, there is some explicit limit on the use of no-knock warrants. There are a number of other provisions in the bill. There are a bunch of protections for youth, which, again, there's always more work to be done here, but a number of these protections did get in. So first, and maybe one of the most exciting, is a local control over school resource officers. So the bill gives superintendents, unfortunately not school boards and not community members, but it gives superintendents the authority to decide whether or not their school district wants to have a school resource officer in the school. The bill also restricts the ways in which schools can share data about students and explicitly prohibits data sharing with outside law enforcement entities. And that restriction, importantly, also covers school resource officers. So school resource officers will also be prohibited from sharing sensitive student data with outside entities. And in particular, this provision is meant to address the sharing of data that leads frequently Black and Brown students into the gang database, and then can lead to deportation and the school to prison and school to deportation pipeline. And then finally, the bill expands access to expungement for people who have juvenile records. A couple of other sort of one-off pieces that are really interesting that made it into the bill. First, there's a requirement that the Department of Public Health collect and publish data on law enforcement related injury and death. And this, as far as I know, I think that this might be a first in the nation kind of data collection, specifically requiring the Department of Public Health, which is of course in the health, which is within Health and Human Services, to look at and consider police violence as a public health issue, which of course many of us on the call already use that lens, but it is a big deal that the state will be using that lens as well. And importantly, and I should have flagged this earlier, this provision about the data collection, law enforcement related injury and death includes, in that definition of law enforcement, corrections is also included. So one thing that we lost in the bill with the certification and decertification of officers is that corrections officers are not covered by that. So most of the bill applies only to police, but this particular provision applies to police and corrections. And that is super significant because I think we all know the horrific conditions that people are under when they're incarcerated and the kinds of injury and death that unfortunately routinely happens and goes unreported. I mean, DOC until recently and perhaps still was underreporting COVID deaths. So, they're avoiding accountability at all costs. And hopefully this will bring a different kind of a lens with the public health lens and having this data collection and reporting be under HHS. It directs, with this provision specifically, the HHS and DPH are directed to promulgate regulations to implement, and those are supposed to be promulgated by the end of this year. So we'll be watching really closely to see what that looks like, and hopefully this produces some helpful data and gets DPH and HHS a little more interested in protecting the public from police violence and violence in correctional institutions. The bill also clarifies that police misconduct investigations are public records. This was a big deal this has been a big deal in other states that are working on police reform. New York had one of the more high profile versions of this legislation go through in December. In Massachusetts, before the police reform legislation passed, the outcome of investigations was a public record, but the underlying investigatory materials were not subject to the Public Records Act. So this makes all of those materials also subject to the Public Records Act. So you may hear that I have not talked about two of the biggest things that the ACLU and Progressive Mass were fighting for, and those are qualified immunity reform and limits on the use of facial surveillance technology. So those are two things that were included in the bill, but in not very strong forms. So qualified immunity reform did pass in some form in this bill, but it's unfortunately related to decertification. So officers will still enjoy qualified immunity unless they are decertified by the post commission. And we are pretty troubled by that because I think it makes it less likely that officers are going to get decertified if post commission members know that if they decertify an officer, they're also going to be exposing them to personal liability for their illegal actions. I think it's going to be even less likely that officers are going to be decertified. So there are a couple bills in this session to try to get more significant qualified immunity reform to get the version that was originally passed in the Senate bill in the summer. And those bills are filed by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz has a bill on qualified immunity, and Representative Mike Day has a bill on another piece of the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act that's closely connected. On face surveillance, this was very disappointing. The legislature put a very strong face surveillance regulation on Charlie Baker's desk, and he rejected that and sent it back with amendments, and that got pretty unfortunately gutted in the final legislation. So there is a limit. Law enforcement will have to get court orders to use face surveillance technology, but there are no due process protections for criminal defendants. It's not a warrant requirement, and there are also no prohibitions on other public entities or law enforcement possessing the technology. So we are supporting a bill, again, this session that would put some of those pieces back into the regulation. And on both of those, on face surveillance and qualified immunity and a number of other issues, the bill created about a dozen study commissions. And we are cautiously optimistic about what these commissions are going to produce. So they're on all kinds of issues ranging from qualified immunity and face surveillance to structural racism in correctional facilities, in probation, in parole, also an examination of the civil service law, an examination of the state police cadet training committee, and a few other really critical pieces. Interestingly, all of those commissions have reporting deadlines of September or December of this year. And we're really hoping that people will pay close attention to what those commissions are doing. They haven't started meeting yet. But also, if they produce good reports and strong recommendations for new legislation, it feels like the legislature has built in time to consider that new legislation and perhaps do police reform 2.0 at the end of this session. So we really hope that we'll be able to hold the legislature and these commissions feet to the fire as they implement the police reform legislation to really make sure that it leads to real reform and real change. I know that Jonathan was just talking in the last session about some of the deficiencies we've seen in implementation of the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act. And I think we're all really hoping that the state will get it right and lean into change a lot sooner this time around. There's also, as I said, going to be a lot of promulgating of regulations. We lost some critical definitions in the use of force limit section that I hope will get through regulations as well. And before I turn it back, I'll just add that most of the provisions that I've talked about only go into effect on July 1st. And some of them don't go into effect until December in order to give agencies time to do rulemaking. So I think we'll all really need to pay close attention to what happens after July 1st to make sure that the post commission is appointed and that they actually start doing investigations when they receive complaints and publishing the data so that we can all keep track and hold them to account. That I'll pause, and I think we also want to leave time for questions. So happy to go into more detail on anything.
Thank you, Oami. I'm kind of laughing because I guarantee every one of those commissions is going to file for an extension. So I wouldn't expect to see them this year.
I mean, none of them have started, so that's fine. If their deadline is September, but I'm ever the optimist.
More of an optimist than myself. So thank you for that comprehensive overview of the legislation and what's missing. And with that, I want to introduce Felicia Sullivan, who, full disclosure, is from my town of Watertown. And so thanks so much for Felicia for being here. So Felicia has been leading us in trying to address bias and racism in policing here in town. And she graduated from Suffolk University Law School in 2008 and is currently Director of Labor and Employee Relations and Assistant General Counsel at Cambridge Health Alliance. But she has a particularly unique perspective on these issues because she began her career as an assistant district attorney in Middlesex County to Marion Ryan. So she brings her unique and very valuable perspective as chair of the Police Policy Working Group in Watertown. And we are so lucky to have her here. So Felicia, thank you for agreeing to speak, and I will pass the mic off to you.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, everybody. So Caroline is right. I'm a former prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 5 years. And actually in between my current position and being a prosecutor, I did spend 7 years in state government. So that was actually what precipitated some of our, some really good data that we were able to receive from the police department. So essentially how I got started in all of this was in July of 2020, we created a police policy reform group, which was created after when all of the discussions started happening related to George Floyd. And in particular, there was a session with Senator Brownsberger and our chief of police, during which time I know that there is a sentiment of me and others in that group that potentially there wasn't enough being done or evaluated internally in Watertown related to potential police reform. In particular, their position was that they're accredited and that was sufficient to address any potential issues. What we ended up doing, we created this, I created this police policy reform group after one of our members of Watertown for Citizens for Black Lives was evaluating the use of force of the Watertown Police Department, was comparing it at that time with the 8 Can't Wait and Campaign Zero recommendations. And we ended up having a couple of discussions with the Watertown Police Department around that. We also decided to put in a couple of public records requests, which we crafted in a way to look at our the data of arrests, citations, and field inquiries, really for Black people in particular, but also for other races in Watertown. Upon receiving that data, we were kind of surprised when we received it because we realized that the report that we received back from Watertown PD stated in their own words that African-American individuals are overrepresented in all 3 categories for arrests, citations, and field inquiries. So luckily we had a good group of there were some people who were in data analytics as a job, and they were able to flesh out the data. And there's evidence that in particular that the 1 in 4, so Black Watertown residents are 5 times more likely to be arrested than white Watertown residents. 1 in 4 white residents who were arrested had a warrant. So they were required to be arrested, and none of the Black residents who were arrested had a warrant. This is a pattern that's seen throughout other towns in Massachusetts, so it's not unique to Watertown, but it was concerning when we looked at it because we felt like there should be something done about it. And we did have some discussions with the town, but we feel like with Watertown, but we feel like there weren't, they didn't provide us with a response to what they were going to do. It was more about explaining away the data. So the other thing that we learned as well was that this is not something that's new. It's been in their data at least for 5 years. And, you know, we had like I said, we met with the police department and they didn't provide a proposal for how they were going to address it. So what we did, we joined forces with a few other groups in town and created a new group called, we called it the Joint Police Reform Group in Watertown. And we put forward 10 different requests for the police department, in particular to our data and Watertown Citizens for Black Lives. We are, you know, looking for data to be more transparent. We feel like going through the public records process is not the best way to get the data. A lot of other towns nearby have their data online. There's also some disparities in how they're reporting the data. They use different terminology for various racial and ethnic groups, so it's not consistent in how it's reviewed. And even though in the report, it does say that Hispanic people are overrepresented with respect to arrests and field inquiries and slightly underrepresented in citations, it's hard to, we weren't even able to evaluate that and sufficiently because the way that they reported it wasn't consistent throughout the records. So we've just more focused in on how the data relates to Black people and the impact on them. We also are concerned that those disparities aren't necessarily a cause for alarm, and we wonder, well, what percentage would be a cause for alarm for the police department? So we are also hoping that, I know that thankfully the police reform legislation that was just discussed is a great starting point, but we're hoping that the use of force be amended as soon as possible to align with the legislation. And we are also requesting as well that internal investigations, right now, anytime somebody files a complaint against Watertown Police Department, it's investigated fully by the chief only. And it appears from the ones that we've seen, there's not a complete investigation. It's really only looking at what the police officer had to say about the situation, and doesn't involve a full, thorough investigation. So our group is hoping to create, or we're recommending a more transparent and community involved process with investigations. And some of the others within our group are actually asking for a review board so that we're able to have community discussions. Now, my group is not about defunding the police, but there are people within our group who are hoping to do that. What we're hoping to do primarily is just have a dialogue, talk through the issues and come together for supporting people of color within the town, reducing the number of arrests and citation, improving training, and there's just more that needs to be done. And I hope that we're able to eventually reach a point where that number starts to go down. But I will note as well, something that's impactful is, I'm not sure if you all have seen that September 2020 study that was commissioned by SJC Chief Justice Gantz, who actually passed away recently, but Harvard Law School, and ended up doing a study which shows that there are disparities, racial disparities in the criminal justice system overall, and in Massachusetts. So I think one of the frustrating parts about all of this is that, especially in Massachusetts, is people say, well, Massachusetts is really progressive and we have all these great things going on. But in reality, there's still disparities for people of color in policing. So it's something that we need to address. And I know that Middlesex DA's office is doing an incredible job working on that. And I know that other towns are, and I'd like to see that across the state.
Great. We did have one question, and also if people want to raise their hand, they can, but I did want to ask Felicia a question because you mentioned other towns. What are other towns doing? Do you have, like, that you are I know that you've done a little bit of research in that, that you find are really successfully addressing some of the issues.
Yeah, so I mean, Cambridge is a large department and has been doing a lot for quite some time. But I was actually looking through what Cambridge is doing, and you know, they have a I don't recall the exact name for it right now, but they have a separate review board that involves anytime there's an incident, there's a panel of people who are looking into an incident with a police officer. They have a new, sorry, let me just refer to my document that I pulled together the other day, but they have a new family unit that actually is 2018, and the goal of that is to look at potential disparities in the police force. They have a lot of clinicians. They actually have a clinician on staff. They have a psychiatrist on staff. So there's a lot being done, I think, by Cambridge generally. Another town is Newton. Newton has their mayor put together a task force, a police reform task force that is looking into a lot of these same issues. That's all. There's a lot of stuff online, which is great. So you can go online and look at all of the, like a lot of data. There's a lot of discussions that are happening in a public realm. And I know that Belmont is another town that's been working through all of this too. I recently joined one of their meetings. They had a discussion with the head of internal affairs, Eddie Crispin, and in Boston PD, and DA Marion Ryan, and the chief of police, and also, you know, some people of color in the community organizers in solidarity, I think is the name of the group. They are they brought forward members and also people who are Black who've dealt with the criminal justice system, so they can have a thorough discussion with the community about policing and the impact of people of color. So there's a lot of great stuff going on nearby that we can look at to adjust our policies.
Okay, so Dan, did you ask your question first? Dan?
So
So I was just wondering, because when I look at the police logs for my town, there's no information about race in there. So I was just wondering where that data can be found.
yeah, so they don't usually put that in their logs, but my understanding is that the police department is tracking that on their own. In particular, Watertown PD has to submit a report yearly, and so it's in their annual report. And I think that's something that a lot of the towns have to do as well. So I would just send a records request to them asking for arrest, citation, and field inquiry data based on the basis of race. And I think you'll find that there's probably data available.
Great. And Ziba, do you want to ask your question? Oh, you're sorry.
Sorry, I didn't eat lunch. My blood sugar is dropping. I had two quick questions. One for, I think at the state level, so that may be more Oami, is how big a problem is the influence of the police union? I mean, we knew and heard that they made with allies just thousands of calls. But I'm also, would the legislators have voted the way they were going to anyway, or is that something we really need to counter? So that's one. And then the second is, just from a strategy perspective, there seems to be some overlap at some of the initiatives that are being pushed at the city level, municipal level, and the state level. And I'm just curious, from a strategy perspective, what do you think we should be doubling down at the city level, municipal level versus state? And can we make more progress on some things at the municipal level that are going to be too tough at the state level?
I'm happy to take the first one. The influence of police unions are a huge problem. I mean, your question, Eva, is a really good one. Like whether if there had been less influence, legislators still would have voted the same way. I mean, I think that there are certainly legislators who, you know, will use the police opposition as cover or as like validation for a position they may already have had. But we did hear from legislators that they were like, there was a constant barrage of calls. And the thing that was really hard to combat is that the talking points that the police unions pushed out were, they played it really fast and loose with the facts. I mean, they just like asserted lies about how qualified immunity works. And that was just very hard to counter, especially to have, you know, it's much easier for their members to call and say, I'm going to lose my house if this passes, than it is to have, you know, progressive mass members or ACLU members like call and give like a law school seminar about how qualified immunity works or doesn't work. The police union, I mean, I was personally quite shocked by how much money it looked like the police unions spent on this. We haven't done an OCPF review, although maybe we should. I mean, but there were full page ads on A3 of the Boston Globe in August, which is immediately before a primary. I mean, that must have been expensive to place. And so it was, I mean, I think that the police unions were probably almost single-handedly responsible for a lot of the watering down. I mean, there was a lot more energy. I mean, if you look at when the Senate bill came out, oh, yikes. Okay. Well, when the Senate bill came out, it was a really strong bill. And then immediately after that, the police pressure started, and then we sort of lost steam. The thing that was very helpful was having other public unions step forward after the fact and say, you know, like, we support reform. And that was, I mean, I think more of that kind of solidarity is helpful.
Do you have any thoughts, Felicia, on the second question about things that we might be able to make progress on in the municipal level?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to remind everybody that the police reform bill is not the solution. That's a part, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. And each community is unique. And I think it's, you know, you need to have those conversations with them and figure out how you can create trust in policing and how you can address any disparities on that level. So I know that many people are struggling, you know, to work through these issues and get attention and really make an impact. But I would say keep at it. You know, it's critical that you hold the police accountable in your city or town.
Great, thanks. Allison, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I was just asking around the post commission, who appoints or who gets to appoint the members of the commission, how many, and are they staggered terms? So like, is this law enforcement entities appointing to the commission?
Yes, yeah, most of the appointments are, well, so the AG and the governor have appointments. Some of those appointments have to be from lists of recommended appointees that other organizations submit. I was trying to pull up the legislation, but the legislature's website is like down for repairs today, so I can't tell you exactly who gets to appoint, but I know NASW sends a list of a number of social workers. There are also some slots that are for advocacy related folks or people with particular background in like civil rights litigation. The appointments are staggered for the next few years. So, and there are term limits. So appointees are appointed in general for, I think, a 5-year term, although the first appointments are for shorter amounts so that you don't have like the whole class turning over at once. And then I think there's a 10-year term limit as well.
Great. And Ziba, question? Oh.
They were answered.
Oh, okay. So we have 2 minutes left. We can either go back now, or if anybody has one last question, we have just 2 minutes left. Anyone have,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
No,
Go ahead,
Felicia,
Zeba.
I want to hear from you.
I wanted to just make a clarifying point because I think that history is important, that all of this police reform stuff actually, when I was in the state Senate 10 years ago, Senator Wilkerson filed a racial profiling bill. And a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in the police reform bills was in the racial profiling bill. So when you're asking about why there's no race information coming in, the police have adamantly refused to provide that information. So the information that you will get from the police reports, anything you get from the police department is when an arrest is made, not when, sorry, I should be on video, not when someone is actually pulled over. So when Senator Chain Diaz came in, we refiled the bill. We actually increased it. So we were trying to do electronic readers. So when you get pulled over on your license, it used to say race, they took that away. So we wanted the police to give out e-tickets so that they would actually hit a button to determine who it was, the race of the person that they were pulling over. They refused to do it and they claimed that it was a safety issue. Obviously, hitting one button to say what someone's race is not a safety issue, given what we already know what's going on. A lot of the towns that you all are asking about are the towns where the police were most adamant that they did not want to supply that information. So when I look at the police reform bills now, it's very weird to me, for me to hear how they're so adamant about it. Anything about race, they don't want to supply. When it comes to the police report, they have to do it because it becomes part of the court document where that is identified. So the information that you really want is not in the police report.